Okay, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of This Week in Hearing. Today, I'm joined by Marlan and Wade with iotaMotion, the winner of the 2022 Hearing Health Matters Innovator of the Year Award. So, Marlan and Wade, thanks so much for being here. I want to give you guys an opportunity to talk all about iotaMotion and the technology that you've been developing. So why don't we start maybe with a little bit of a background? We'll start with you, Marlan. Just maybe a brief bio and then how iotaMotion came to be.
Well, thanks, Dave, for having us. We really appreciate this opportunity. And I'm a neurotologist, which means I'm an inner ear skull-based surgeon and spend a lot of my life dealing with patients with hearing loss and cochlear implants and in an environment where we really have thought a lot about how we can best help patients take advantage of this technology. And so the motivation comes from the imperative to be able to put in an electrode array into a very small, delicate structure and not cause damage. That becomes really important as we see an expanding number of patients with hearing loss, as we get an older population, as we see an expanding number of patients who can benefit from the technology, as we see an expanding number of surgeons who need to be able to do this. There's a lot of things that need to happen in order for every patient to have a good, consistent outcome with this technology and to get in and so that people can benefit. I think a lot of that's motivated what we did. A lot of it has to do with some of the reservations that people have. So as I was early on, we were doing these very, very short hybrid cochlear implants that only went, maybe 10 millimeters into a cochlea, whereas a standard one might go in anywhere from 20 to 30 millimeters into the cochlea. And they worked really well because they saved the patient's low frequency hearing. They had a lot of benefit from combining this electrical stimulation with their residual acoustic hearing. But some of them go on to lose hearing, and for a variety of reasons. And then what happens if you just have a short electrode? And so that was another motivation is, not only how do we enable these electrodes to be able to be placed very delicately and consistently, and so they cause as least trauma as possible, but maybe even down the road, how do we then be able to adjust the position of the electrode in the cochlea so that it matches up with that individual's patient's hearing needs? And so kind of individualizing the technology for each patient. Those were kind of the ideas that were knocking around in my mind as we started to think about this.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so when you, at the University of Iowa, when you started to kind of like bring this thing to fruition, what was the big breakthrough for you? What was the aha moment, if you will, where you started to bring this to life and then bring it ultimately into its current iteration?
Yeah, so that's great. There was a couple of critical, I would say, steps along the way. The aha moment was actually many, many years ago when I said, this is really what we need to do. The challenge was, I was busy doing a lot of other things. I had my own clinical practice. I have a lab that looks at other things as well. It was just busy time. So I really didn't have anyone that I could dedicate or focus on it. And then Chris Kaufman, who's the co-founder of the company, came and he was in a program where he could work 2 years in my lab. And so I sort of pitched the idea to him, and he does have a background in biomedical engineering, and he was very interested. I think he saw the importance of what we were doing, and really he had the capacity to dedicate time, and he had the expertise to work on it. And so really it was Chris and I getting together. I think it was the first time we could actually try and materialize or put into action some of the other thoughts that we had. And so Chris was critical. And so you'll hear a theme that this has really been, even though it's idea-based, it's also people-based. So Chris was a critical component of that. Having an environment like the University of Iowa and my surgical colleagues here was a critical component of even some of the original ideas. The other critical piece was, as Chris and I were doing this, we early on got matched up with Eric Timko, and he really sat down with us and looked at it, not just from a concept, this is a good idea, but what could you actually get into an OR and have, an FDA approved product that actually a surgeon can actually use instead of sort of what Eric would have described as a science experiment. And so having his expertise in kind of bringing in knowledge around regulatory and what's feasible, what's doable, how can we actually materialize this, not just from a concept, but in actually something that can help patients. So that was another critical step, was bringing Eric on board, getting his ideas around that. And then of course, his helping with some fundraising, and it takes money to kind of do these things. So I think those were the key leaps or steps that kind of helped launch this.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And I guess now would be a good time to just kind of like break down what exactly iotaMotion is, what iotaSOFT is. So I know that, this is a robotic system more or less for cochlear insertion, but just help to kind of, for the audience, really paint a picture of what you're trying to solve with this, and kind of like how it compares to the status quo of the mechanical insertion, and maybe some of the upside of having this be done by robotics.
Yeah, so maybe an equivalent is like if you're driving a car, and that if you drive fast, then anytime you bump into something, you're going to cause more damage. And also, if you drive erratically, start, stop, that's going to cause some problems. And the cochlea is kind of this very delicate, essentially fluid-filled space with these very thin membranes in it. And those membranes, because it's a closed space, or essentially a closed space, as you increase the volume of the cochlea, as you put in the electrode, you generate these incredible pressure spikes that need to be relieved or vented out, or else you're just going to essentially rupture membranes or things like that. So what's really manually what happens is, surgeons have known, I think, for a long time, that it's important to go really slow. So when we were trying to, for instance, in patients with really good hearing, and we're trying to save their hearing, we would try and put it in as slow as possible to limit the amount of trauma that we're causing, to limit these pressure spikes. The problem is, in a human, even in the best surgeon's hand, human kinetics are limited. And we basically do a lot of start and stopping and jittering on a micro scale. This is on a very small scale. And so the nice thing about robotics, and what iotaMotion does, or iotaSOFT does, is it takes and allows that insertion to be done at a much slower speed than a surgeon can do, and much more consistently. So there's not this variation or spikes and peaks and things. And so that's really what we're trying to do. The other, I think, critical component of when we thought about robotics, this is really a tool built by surgeons for surgeons. So we really wanted it to be something that would kind of easily fit into the natural flow of an OR and solve a problem in the OR, rather than just having technology for technology's sake, or robotics for robotics' sake, or having engineers that don't do the surgery but come in and have these elegant, big behemoth arms that do all these little motion things, but really couldn't practically be adopted across lots and lots of centers and sites. And so we tried to design it that way, where it would be something that wouldn't add, 3 hours or lots of complexity to the case, but could just achieve what we thought was really critical about the case consistently across a wide range of surgeons.
Yeah, like whenever I think of adding and augmenting, robotics into like an OR, I do think of like the big mechanical arms and all that. And this is just like a really small thing. And I like what you said there too, that it's kind of like, designed by surgeons for surgeons. And so it seems like, and Wade, I'll bring you into the conversation now. It seems like one of the cool things about this is it very much is appealing to kind of like the whole current cochlear ecosystem, from the patients to the surgeons that are actually fitting it, to the companies that design, that make and create the cochlear implants. And I know, Wade, you had been at Cochlear before. What brought you to iotaMotion, and what did you see that got you excited to come work for this company?
Yeah, so thanks for having us. So in my past at Cochlear, I was overseeing the implant, system, and particularly, I worked pretty closely with Marlan, and so obviously had a relationship, with him and understood what he was working on. And so I had a brief stint actually at Bose looking at over-the-counter hearing aids, but have been in the hearing space for quite some time, and really intrigued by the impact that a cochlear implant can have on people's lives. And I think Marlan alluded to this a little earlier, but if you look at the data, there's cochlear implants are severely underpenetrated in the sense that a lot of people could benefit from them, and there is an expectation that more and more patients will have better and better hearing. Implant where they're doing okay, but they're not doing as good as they could be. And so I think this technology, is really designed to fit in with all three cochlear implant manufacturers. So we're compatible with MED-EL, Cochlear, and Advanced Bionics electrodes. And the intent of it is to really be able to provide that consistency, across all insertions for the different implant manufacturers and across different surgeons, with the intent of trying to, ultimately reduce the trauma to the cochlea, and subsequently, maintain that greater confidence both from the surgeon and also in the patients of getting a cochlear implant. So we know one of the big barriers, that people come is, am I going to do better? Am I going to lose my residual hearing? We're hoping that this is still a year in or so in terms of in the commercial market, and we're in a limited market release. But we like what we're seeing so far, and the centers that we've been at, and we're continuing to look forward and see what shakes out. But I think for us it's Marlan probably can speak to this a little bit, but there's patients that we're now coming asking for a robotic system. And I think that's just telling of the impact robotics can have both in the wider medical field, but also in cochlear implants. So I don't know, Marlan, if you want to chime in on any of that.
Yeah, I think what you alluded to, Wade, is something that we've thought about, and I think is really critical, is that there's an expanding number of patients who we need to be able to consider about receiving cochlear implants. And these patients have the highest demand in terms of being able to preserve their structure and function and give them benefit. So personally, what I want to see is 90% of patients get 90% word scores at 90% of the time. So, we really want to be able to be at that level, a 90% level, where 90% of surgeons consistently get a good result. 90% of patients get excellent, not these flat outcomes that we're dealing with now, but better. And that requires a lot of things. That requires that we implant healthier ears. That requires that when we do implant them, we maintain the function that's existing there, and that we're supplementing that function, not replacing the function. So think of a cochlear implant not just as a replacement for a dead ear, but think of it as a supplement for a partially diseased ear. And these are kind of the things that motivate us. And I think where we have to be as a industry, because until there's hair cell regeneration or something like that, hearing aids are always going to be limited because the end organ is just not healthy enough for the stimulation. So it takes it takes both electrical and acoustic hearing. It takes preservation of what you have. And, that's what's really, I think, exciting and motivating and imperative about what we need to do as an industry, not just iotaMotion, but as an industry.
Yeah, and I think it's really exciting too that you're seeing the candidacy requirements from the Medicare side of things are expanding, and so like there's more people that are eligible for a cochlear implant, and like you said earlier, we have an aging population, so it seems like this is a great area to be innovating around because I think that there probably is, it's a really underserved market in terms of the proliferation. Not enough people have been fit with these, and I think that a lot of that comes down to maybe the stigma that people maybe associate with like what the process is like getting implanted to begin with. And so if you can make that, if you can alleviate that, I think for the prospective patient, that they know that there are these new methods of inserting the electrodes. And I just think that's going to really bode well for the appeal of this so that more people get on board with it, which coincides with, kind of what's happening from a financial standpoint as well.
Well, I was just going to tag on to a comment you made, Dave, is that, that as CMS just expanded the criteria, as that criteria is expanding, then that places even more demand on surgeons, industry, and things to be better at preserving things, because we're going into healthier things. We're not just fixing a completely dead ear. We're really going into healthy tissue here. But the other thing is there's other technologies that are also coming out that are also exciting. I mean, we have now electrophysiology, electrocochleography, where in an ear that's receiving an implant, you can be putting a sound or an acoustic signal and using electrodes on the cochlear implant or extracochlear electrodes that record the function of that ear. And the nice thing is if you can integrate that with robotics, then you have not only a sensing system, but you have a control system. It's like an automatic braking system for your car where, oh boy, a deer just ran in front of you and the brakes stop and things like that are really going to be what's required. So it's going to be a marriage of a few technologies. And I think robotics can sit nicely kind of at the core hub of that as being the control mechanism, that whether you're doing image guidance or whether you're doing electrophysiological feedback or whatever, you need that control to make those other sensors meaningful.
Did you have a background in robotics? Clearly you kind of saw the problem, but how did you, it sounds like you said there were a lot of really important people along the way, but how did this kind of like form into a robotics company? I guess that was the inevitable path for what you were trying to do.
That was what I could see. That's what we needed to do. I did not have any, I come from a cell and molecular neurobiology background. And so that's what I'm saying is I had ideas around this for a long time, but I didn't have personal ability to do it. And I didn't have capacity to do what really needed to be done. And that's why Chris was so critical and important for what we're doing is, Chris showed up and we had funding to, he could work in the lab for 2 years and we could support him. And so that was important. And he had the expertise and the drive, the initiative and the ambition to do it. So.
Yeah, I feel fortunate that now I know your company and what you all are doing. I think it's super exciting. So maybe help to share with the audience and help us understand where you go from here. I know that I think there's somewhere upwards of like 20 of these insertions that you've done so far. Is it, what's kind of the roadmap from here and what can we expect out of your company for the remainder of this year and into next?
Well, I should say one other thing, and Wade can maybe mention cover this some too, but bringing Wade on board and people like Wade. So, Wade, he's outstanding, and having someone who has the expertise, knowledge of electrodes, the expertise, knowledge of the surgery, the expertise, knowledge of the implants, and even the surgeons and the environment in which they live and things like that. Having someone like that can be kind of in charge of getting our product into other surgeons' hands is absolutely critical because he gets it. He understands the little nuances of not only how our device works, but of all the rest that's going around cochlear implants from a surgical point of view. And so, it's having the right team together. And I think we've been very fortunate that we have a great team that works on this. So I mean, there's sort of the short term, the long term, and then the very, very long term. And I think really what we focus on now is, the next few months or next 6 months or whatever. And that is really getting the technology out into hands of more surgeons. I think now at Iowa, we're probably closer to 60 cases, maybe. I don't know where we are, somewhere along there. And Wade's been out 5, 6, 7 centers across the US doing other cases. So the numbers are getting larger, and we learn as it gets adopted. That's why we limit. Initially, we didn't want to just release this out into the wild. We wanted to make sure that we could understand well how it was performing, and how we can make sure that as we get this out into the hands of everybody, that it's going to be effective and work well for them. And that's what Wade's been so critical about doing. And that's what we're about the next, 6 months, is really just making sure we as a company have systems in place and mechanisms that we can train, and that the product is working as we expect it to work. And if we need to make little tweaks here and there, things like that.
That's awesome. So Wade, what, boots on the ground, you're actually in these, interacting with these surgeons and stuff, like what has the feedback been like?
Yeah. So, like Marlan said, we've been at about 6 or 7 centers. We expect to be in probably 10 to 15 by the end of the year, and probably grow that to around 20 or 25 next. Positive to date in the sense of, I think some of the key things that people realize is it does provide stability. So you have both hands available now, and you can have a little more flexibility. So it provides stability of the electrode. It obviously does control down to 0.1 millimeters per second, which, a normal typical surgeon is around 1 millimeter per second, potentially, is kind of what they aim for. So, when I say that, it means one thing, but when you actually see it, it's a different situation. So I think people are oftentimes saying, "Oh yeah, I go with a really slow insertion," and then they see it in their surgery, or the nurse even in the OR sees it, and they're looking on the screen and they're like, "Is it moving?" And oftentimes I have to ask the same question, because it's going so slow, which is the point. So I think people are oftentimes impressed by just the fact of like, okay, yeah, this really does provide a consistent, smooth insertion, which is what the goal is. It provides that stabilization. And I think also, like you mentioned, or it was discussed earlier, robotics, I think get this rap of, oh, it's this massive system. It's going to add an hour. It's going to add 2 hours. And, sure, yeah, there's a learning curve in the initial case or two, but, once you do 1 or 2 cases, I mean, it's, 5-10 minutes, to set the system up and get it in there. And that includes the actual insertion time, which, is the goal is to slow everyone down, right? That's the whole point in that situation. So, I think for us, it's been good to learn. We're already looking at, ways we can make tweaks for Gen 2, and how we can expand, and also, like Marlan mentioned, how we can incorporate with other enabling technologies and other, systems. But overall, it's been a good start. We've been fortunate to work with a couple really good docs and surgeons across the country, and at good centers, and we'll continue to look for more partnerships of people that appreciate enabling technology, see the value of robotics, see the value of slow atraumatic insertions and the impact that's going to have on the industry across. We know that with any new tech, it's early adopters first, that are seeing that, and then we'll continue to build the evidence, of both clinical evidence and benchtop cadaveric evidence, and have both Iowa and other centers be a critical part of that. So we're looking forward to what's to come.
Yeah, I should mention. So Wade is a hard worker. He's boots on the ground. He's actually on the ground. He's covering cases, and so he has to pull off the road. He doesn't have a Texas drawl, even though we have a Texas presence. That's actually just his audio from being on the road on a hot spot kind of thing, and with actual leaves falling and a real back instead of a stuffy.
Truly in nature.
He's awesome. But he did bring up an important point that maybe we've touched on a little bit that I think is really, as we think about robotics, it really does enable a lot of these other technologies. And so, some of the cool things that we've been able to do is like, we can go so slow that, electrocochleography becomes really, really meaningful now.
Yeah.
Or these transimpedance measures that sometimes you want to make around an electrode that you would have to otherwise run once the electrode's in position. You can start to run things in real time. One of the interesting, and then Wade mentioned, kind of the control that you have. So this was an interesting patient I had just last week or week before where she was deaf in one ear, but could hear in the other ear. And we did it where she was under local anesthetic. She wasn't completely asleep. And so we were putting sound into her good ear as we put the electrode in very slowly robotically, and we're stimulating the electrode and we're pitch matching to the acoustic signal in her other ear as we're putting it in. And she could tell us, right? She says, oh, that's higher, that's a little, that's getting closer. Oh, that's pretty close. That's it. Okay, now it's lower than that. And so we could do that all. And she was actually moving her head and doing these things, but the electrode was perfectly still because it secured to her head. So even though she's moving around and doing things, it worked out great. It was a lot of fun. I think the patient enjoyed doing it, and we had a lot of fun too. So
yeah, I just find this whole thing to be so fascinating because, it's like, this is what robotics in the medical setting looks like. And I think it's so cool that like it unlocks things that at least personally, I hadn't originally thought of, like, it super, super slow abilities that, we as humans don't have. So it's like, what else can these things do? This seems to just be one very specific use case of something that probably can be applied to a whole range of other things.
We hope so. We think so.
Absolutely. Well, thank you two so much for coming on. iotaMotion. This is an exciting new company that we in the hearing health space need to keep an eye on. I'm certainly going to be looking at everything that you all are doing. I just think it's awesome that like this technology is conducive to, like you said, with the 3 big cochlear implant companies. So I do think that this is going to be a name that we hear more and more of. And I'm really excited to see what you all do because it feels like you're just getting started.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks for having us. It's good to see you.
Absolutely. All right, everybody. Thanks. Take care.